beat goes on. The beat goes on. Drums keep pounding a rhythm to the brain. La-da-da-da-dee, la-da-da-da-da. Charleston was once the rage, History has turned the page, The miniskirt, the current thing, Teeny Bopper is our newborn king, And the beat goes on. The beat goes on. Drums keep pounding a rhythm to the brain. La-da-da-da-dee, la-da-da-da-da. The grocery store, the supermarket, Little girls will break their hearts, And men still keep on marching off to war. Electrically they keep a baseball score. And the beat goes on. The beat goes on. Drums keep pounding a rhythm to the brain. La-da-da-da-dee, la-da-da-da-da. Grandmas sit in chairs and reminisce. Boys keep chasing girls to get a kiss. The cars keep going faster all the time. Mom still cries, hey buddy, have you got a dime? And the beat goes on. The beat goes on. Drums keep pounding a rhythm to the brain. La-da-da-da-dee, la-da-da-da-da. And the beat goes on. Yes, the beat goes on. And the beat goes on. And the beat goes on. The beat goes on.
Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an institute for the humanities and alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to learn about the beat going on, the Strauss-Howe Four Turnings Thesis. This is part of our Cycles course here at ApocatastasisInstitute. This is class number 9 of 10. Alhamdulillah, to doubtlessly quote Ibn Khaldun. And if you're interested in this subject, I encourage you to check out various of the resources on this site, including previous intro lectures. Following each one of these, of course, we have a live private class, and we will be running in the semesters ahead this course. And like any course, it's always new and improved each time it's run. I can think about 10 more people that ought to be on this list, 10 more historians. So this was a great trial run. And in any case, we call this course properly the Sons of Issachar from the Holy Bible. The Sons of Issachar knew the times. The image on our posters of the Wheel of Fortune. And you can see our various subjects. But here we are. The beat goes on. And let myself get my ego seen to properly. Get on the page. And we'll get some background music and we'll be off to the races. Of course, That was Sonny and Cher. Now, the opening image is from a Broadway play of a few years ago, Heroes of the Fourth Turning. And it is from a mention of this play that I initially learned about this concept before I understood the reference to the Fourth Turning book by William Strauss and Neil Howe. I knew about this play and this interesting title, Heroes of the Fourth Turning. And it turns out that playwrights read the papers and they read novels and books. And I should think New York City still is the center of publishing. And what this play deals with actually is our time and different archetypes, shall we say, of our time, very appropriate to the proper thesis of the Strauss-Howe gentleman. And this play and us take place right now on stage and in real life in the crises cycle. So we have a lot to break down here. And to do that, we have all sorts of helpful charts and one very helpful essay. Again, we will break up into private class hereafter. Now, one of the meta camps when you learn of this type of historiography, one of the theses that you come across is that history is linear. Another alternative to that is that history is cyclical, and we've spent our entire semester here going back and forth between the two. And you can have a middle ground where things are like a curlicue, where they are both cyclical and linear. And you can even play around with the thesis that things naturally are one way, but they can be interfered with. And so history might be cyclical, but you could jack with it in such a way that it become linear, or you can somehow disrupt the cycles. So there's a great variation to these. And in our final meeting, we can talk about critiques and criticisms of this whole approach, because lately, in fact, someone had brought up this worthy point of the arbitrariness of these models. So we will revisit this worthy criticism at the end of our course. But for now, we are going to hang out with William Strauss and Neil Howe. Here is an image of their book, very 1990s looking indeed. And much like Toynbee, the people who believe they run this world read books, and they read Toynbee. And whether or not you agree with Toynbee or Spengler or Ibn Khaldun or whatever, the people who believe they matter on this earth politically and socially, they do believe these points. And so it behooves us, especially if we have an interest in current events and geopolitics, it behooves us to be familiar with these deeper discussions that don't make it onto your podcast, much less your nightly news, much less your newspaper, but ideas which very much are behind the people who believe they run this world. William Strauss and Neil Howe's American Prophecy, The Fourth Turning, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. So much like Spengler and certain so-called alternative right circles, the fourth turning, from different people altogether, has been dusted off. And even from a cursory perusal of those podcasts and newspapers, you'll be aware that different political combinations, let's say, are quite interested in 2030. The UN infamously has a paper on Agenda 2030. And Agenda, what's the other one? 2020? How does that work? There's Agenda 21 is the overall vision for the UN for the 21st century, and then Agenda 2030 is a specific model for immediately in the decade ahead. And in any case, that number 2030 comes up, and it's interesting that when you look at these different interpretations of history, whether that's St. Augustine or Giambattista Vico, Karl Marx, we'll make it into the revised course, Hegel there. One of the ways you can provide even greater insight, indeed, is to be familiar with multiple of these theories. And when they coalesce or overlap, you might really be over the target. And so when you have someone like Samuel Benner, I'm afraid we haven't given Benner the attention that he deserves. We will touch on him before we're done, as promised. But, when you have Benner making economical predictions, and that's hitting the same points as, we'll say, Marx or Toynbee or Strauss-Howe, two gentlemen, Strauss-Howe theory, and there's an overlap here, we might see even greater validation to their approach. And so it's interesting the attention that the so-called movers and shakers give to the fourth turning, whether or not they're specifically reading the work of these gentlemen is irrelevant. What's interesting is that these gentlemen, as we'll find out, palpitate a great crisis starting around 2008 and continuing through the 2030s. That's their fourth turning, hence the name of the Broadway play of a few years ago, Heroes of the Fourth Turning. It's interesting, maybe even more interesting, if it's an independent observation that you have, for instance, globalists, for lack of a better term, interested in the 2030s, and you have these gentlemen that predict a crisis, and you have, this other camp of thinking, and they all are overlapping in their observation that the World War II order is breaking down, and something will have to necessarily replace. And you'll find all sorts of explanations of this from the past few years, because this book has been revisited, let's say. The author says, ever since I read it, one of the books I find myself thinking about most often when I think about current events is The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. We often talk about the silent baby boomer, Gen X, millennial generation, now Gen Z, thinking of different generations as having different attitudes. And this owes a lot to Neil Howe and William Strauss's book, Generations, the history of America's future from 1584 to 2069. In their 1997 book, The Fourth Turning, William Strauss and Neil Howe used their theory of generational replacement combined with generational attitudes to predict the future, right? So we want to always add our new scholars into this larger discussion that we've been having. So you have, especially from Abrahamic religions, this idea of linear time. We see this in the books of Kings and Chronicles in the Holy Bible. You see it in its own way in the Islamic Quran. You have St. Augustine. In other words, let me rephrase that. In other words, in Abrahamic religions, you have this idea of God's revealing of himself in time. In perennialist or so-called pagan religions, very often they'll be cyclical because of their focus on the natural world as being a medium of divine interaction. St. Augustine, coming from the Christian tradition, we'll see history moved by working with God's grace or rejecting God's grace. Ibn Khaldun, coming from the more communal-oriented Islamic society, himself being a jurist, will see history moved and civilizations rising and falling based on asabiya, on social cohesion, either strengthening or dissolving. Giambattista Vico, much like Oswald Spengler, saw individual civilizations not in any sense on a linear, but rather on a cyclical model. Benner, we'll get to, was a good American, just wanted to make money. So he has his economical prophecies, so-called. Toynbee had a whole complicated series of ideas that he explained in 30 years and 20 volumes about the we'll say the border crises, and then the internal proletariat, and the challenge and response, as he called it. And now we have Neil Howe and Strauss. What's the engine that moves history? Is it God's grace, social cohesion, economics, like Marx would say, spirit, like Hegel? No, for Strauss and Howe, here's our key to understand Strauss and Howe. It's generational attitudes that keep replaying. That's what's unique about them, right? When you think Augustine in the city of God and the city of man, it's grace that comes to mind. When you think of Hegel, it's spirit, it's Geist. When Neil and William Howe, Neil Strauss-Howe, when they're looking at history, what's explaining this is that the generations, they have a predominant archetype. You can see on the right of the screen, those archetypes are broadly the artist, the prophet, the nomad, and the hero. And that these just keep cycling through. That's why we had the opening song from Sonny and Cher, The Beat Goes On. So the artist is a predominant, whatever we associate with that, we can get into that shortly. All right, that's predominant for certain generations, the prophet, other generations, the nomad, the hero. No man is an island, and time and tide wait for no man. And all the world's a stage. We can use so many beautiful similes, maybe startling similes, because they're all having to do with our mortality. And the reality is a generation doesn't stay there. In fact, that's a very interesting word, generation. We throw the word around. It's actually overused nowadays, I believe. The word generation. It's a very interesting word because it's a word that describes people that are generated around the same time, right? The mommy and daddy, millions of mommy and daddies came together in hanky-panky and made millions of babies around the same time. And those babies will grow up and they will have babies. And these are generations. And then, to use the beautiful language of the Holy Bible, they will be gathered to their fathers. And new generations will rise from the soil, right? And then they will become soil again. And there is this aspect, this cyclical aspect. Well, within that, there is a modality that describes each of the generations. Now, what's the proof for Strauss-Howe? And I'm just going to be referring to them in this type of hyphenated way. What's the proof of this is going to be analyzing, well, what were the significant people that this generation held up? What were the significant pieces of art? Politically, where were their attentions? And so forth and so forth. These things will help the scholar palpitate what is the archetype of each generation. And Strauss-Howe began noticing from the data points that you had the conceptions here. So is there an aspect of the arbitrary here? To a certain extent, yes, but we'll talk about all this in our final meeting. You have data points, you have hard data points, and that's what you can go off of. These are just as valid. I know now I'm getting into maybe not hot water, but warm water. Whether history is a hard science, probably not in the sense of biology or chemistry, but it's not as arbitrary as we make it out. We have hard data points that we can analyze. And one of the ways we can provide against the arbitrary critique, which is a certainly valid critique, especially when it comes to pop history and, your uncle down the corner is talking about history. But one of the ways we can provide against the arbitrariness of this and zoom in and see where all of these scholars we've enjoyed this semester and benefited from are coming from, one of the ways is to have a broad reading, a broad analysis of culture, and that can allow our scholars today, Strauss-Howe, to come up with these categories. They are, yes, there's an aspect of artificiality to this, just like there is in natural science, but it's zoning in on a reality. It doesn't include everything. It's actually kind of like this chart. It's kind of a bell curve. In any case, the key to the Strauss-Howe theory are the generational archetypes. These archetypes will leave an impression on what they call secula. That's a interesting Latin word. It actually goes back to ancient historiography, the secula, means the age. The age. And it's about 80 years. The Holy Bible and many other traditions, right? In the Psalm 89:90, we have the expression, man lives to 70 years or 80 for those who are strong. And that's about a secula. So in the Strauss-Howe theory, each of these circles is about 80 years. About 80 years. Do not get hung up on the specifics. Each turning is about 20 years. Maybe some turnings are 25 years. Maybe some turnings are 30 years. Maybe some are 15, but about 20 years. And so starting at 10 o'clock, let's say, the first turning is the spring of an era. This is the high, and we'll give specifics as we move along. After 20 years have passed, the next generation, which obviously is living at the same time that the rising generation's coming on. So there's a changing of the guard, hence the elbow room. The second turning is the summer. This is the awakening era. The third turning is the fall. This is the unraveling. And then the fourth turning is the winter, the crises, hence heroes of the fourth turning. Hence, as Strauss-Howe predicted, along with Samuel Benner, and in other ways, you can plug in our other historians, hence the focus on our time as a time of great change. The World War II order is now up on 80 years. According to this theory, we should see exactly what we're seeing, which is the international order dominated by these United States is falling apart. And it's involving itself in classical late stage empire behavior. As of this broadcast, including bagging the presidents of other countries and kidnapping them on the pretext of God knows what. But in any case, crises, military conflicts all over, everyone sharpening their swords. I gave a presentation last month on what's going to come after the Ukraine war. Well, that's the big war. The war in Ukraine is just the dress rehearsal. If you listen to the globalists and you watch the behavior of the Russian Federation, both of them are pulling their punches in Ukraine. Both of them are keeping their powder dry. Both of them are sending their second-rate soldiers, their second, third, fourth-rate weaponry to Ukraine. Why are they doing that? Why are they using up the old stocks of ammunition? Because this is not the real fight. The real fight is going to be between NATO and Russia in the 2030s. Right now is just training, effectively. Cold comfort to the men who have been killed. The secula has run its course. This is why the Strauss-Howe theory has been dusted off. Over the past 5 centuries, we're reading from the synopsis of their theory, the Anglo-American society has entered a new era, a new turning every 2 decades or so. At the start of each turning, people change in how they feel about themselves, the culture, the nation, and the future. So all of these define the 4 archetypes of a generation. Turnings come in cycles of 4. Each cycle spans the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 100 years, a unit of time the ancients called the saeculum. Go back to your Plato and his ages of gold and silver and bronze. Go back to your Roman authors who used similar language. Together, the 4 turnings of the saeculum comprise history's seasonal rhythm of growth, maturation, entropy, and destruction. And by the way, if you understand this whole concept of the saecula, the Christian phraseology of in saecula saeculorum has a whole other dimension to it. Which is why it's important, not to get on my pulpit here, is why it's important to understand the classical world, because otherwise you'll see these modern Christian practices and won't realize their profundity. Okay, so recapping in another way, the first turning is a high, it's an upbeat era of strengthening institutions, weakening individualism, when a new civic order imparts and the old value regimes decay. So you'll often see that in the high of a culture is a lot of faith in institutions. The second turning is an awakening, a passionate era of spiritual upheaval when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. The third turning is an unraveling of this order, a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions when the old civic order decays and new values from a regime imparts. And the fourth turning is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval. And they're using the word secular in the context of the secula, not in the context of non-religious. When the values of the regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. Each turning comes with its own identifiable mood, or to purloin Hegel, its own Geist. Always these mood shifts catch people by surprise. Always these mood shifts catch people by surprise. This is human life. This is the human condition. We think life stays the same, but it's not. It's like standing in a river. When you're standing in a river, not only is the water moving, but the soil in very imperceptible ways is also moving. Not just the riverbed, but literally all the soil around the river is moving as well. And this leads to the interesting, very interesting, as a historiographical simile, observation of rivers moving. The Mississippi River at certain points moves. This is why Vicksburg is now like 10 miles inland. Vicksburg was a riverfront city in the Civil War. It was a major riverfront battle in the American Civil War. Vicksburg is far removed from the river now because the Mississippi has moved. Why has the Mississippi moved? Because the ground is constantly moving. It's not just the water or the riverbed. Everything around the river is moving. In fact, if you want to get really philosophical, the only thing that isn't actually moving is the water. You can think about that for a bit. There's a river, it's called the East Aspetuck River here in New Milford. And I can show you with photographs, because I take the photographs, that river has moved at this point probably 8 foot in the past 5 years. The bank of the river has moved, has eaten out 8 foot and has deposited land on the other side, and parts where the river used to be running are now dry and becoming this typical vegetation where the water used to run. And this part of the park that I'm referring to has now been eaten by the river, which is moving in this direction. The same with history. In the current seculum, the first turning, now we're going to use an example. Now these guys, the Strauss-Howe fellows, they take the seculum back to the 16th century. And if what they're saying, which is limited, we'll say, to the Anglosphere, if what they're saying is true, we ought to see similar cycles, maybe on a different timeline, but similar cycles in other peoples. In the current seculum, the first turning was the American high, using recent history. The first turning was the Truman era, that of Eisenhower and Kennedy. As World War II wound down, no one predicted that America would soon become so confident and institutionally muscular, yet so conformist and spiritually complacent. But that's what happened, right? So you see the strengthening of institutions and the dissolving of individuality. The second turning was the consciousness revolution, stretching from the campus revolts of the mid-1960s to the tax revolts of the early 1980s. You only have these revolts if these institutional power is coming under questioning. and if individuality is rising. Before John Kennedy was assassinated, no one predicted that America was about to enter an era of personal liberation and cross a cultural divide that would separate anything thought or said after from anything thought or said before, but that's what happened. The third turning has been the culture wars, an era that began with Reagan's mid-1980s Morning in America speech and is due to expire around the middle of the 00 decade. This is what we now call the aughts, or the early 2000s. 8 or 10 years from now, being when the book is published in the 1990s. Amidst the glitz of the early Reagan years, this is the unraveling. No one predicted that the nation was about to enter an era of national drift and institutional decay, but that's where we are. What's some proof of that? The skepticism of religious institutions, the disillusionment people have in religious institutions like the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, the Jehovah's Witness Church, right? All of these groups have come under great scrutiny, partially because of their own delicts being made public. Institutional decay, the rise of homeschooling is an example of social decay. Because it shows a lack of faith in educational institutions. Also, again, there's a lot of betrayal. I'm not saying these critiques are not without merit. There's a lot of critique of the colleges, right? You have the betrayal of young people going to college and becoming debt slaves. Well, that debt slavery, a neatly oiled machine going back to the early 2000s, and has done a lot to discredit the high esteem that academia was once held in this country. That itself shows a lack of institutional faith. It's not just a matter of the population having faith in institutions, but the institutions acting parasitically, in the case of the student loans, on the population, or the payday loans, or this is much bigger observation, right? Where even the financial institutions are not acting, somewhat copacetically, hand in glove with the population, but see them as prey to be used. Okay, and here's the remarkable prophecy they made in 1997. The fourth turning is history's great discontinuity. It ends one epoch and begins another. So there's some observation, typically a war, which will create the circumstances for the new spring. So the fourth turning is the age of crises, which they predicted being in the 2000s, the aughts as we now call them. And in particular, the Great Recession, the depression of the Bush-Obama era, inaugurated, according to this model, inaugurated the crisis period, which will continue into the early 2030s. And arguably, this dovetails with a lot of military preparations which are being made throughout the world. What you're seeing now, whether that's in Yemen, Palestine, in Africa, in different places, Nigeria, Ukraine, saber rattling in the South China Sea, which has been, I think, renamed by the United States the Indo-Pacific region to piss on China. All of this is just getting the chess pieces on the board into position for the war. The problem, as someone actually said this morning, the problem with this sort of prediction is that people aren't chess pieces. So, right, we have this bipolarity between observational cycles, cyclicality, let's say, and then the X factor, something that lends itself to a more linear view where you have a great man arises, a great event moves history in a different direction. History is seasonal and winter is coming. Like nature's winter, the secular winter can come early or late, right? The seasons are not pinned down hard to the calendar. A fourth turning can be long and difficult, or it can be brief but severe, or perhaps mild. But like winter, it cannot be averted. It must come in its turn. The winter might be mild, but it will be winter. Here in summary are the rhythms of modern history and how they warn us about America's future. The next fourth turning, the crisis, is due to begin shortly after the new millennium, midway through the aughts, around the year 2005. So they're writing this in 1997. They were only 3 years off, if we want to use this model, from the great crash of that year. A sudden spark will catalyze a crisis mood. Remnants of the old social order will disintegrate. Political and economic trust will implode. Real hardship will beset the land with severe distress that could involve questions of class, race, nation, and empire. Yet, this time of trouble will bring seeds of social rebirth. Americans will share a regret about recent mistakes and a resolute new consensus about what to do. The very survival of the nation will feel at stake. Sometime before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history, commensurate with the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the twin emergencies of the Great Depression / World War II. A risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence. It could crack up geographically or succumb to authoritarian rule. If there is a war, it's likely to be one of maximum risk and effort. In other words, it's likely to be a total war. Every fourth turning has registered an upward ratchet in the technology of destruction and in mankind's willingness to use it. In the Civil War, the two capital cities would surely have incinerated each other had they the means. In World War II, America invented a new technology of annihilation, which the nation swiftly did put to use. This time, America will enter a fourth turning with the means to inflict unimaginable horrors and perhaps will confront adversaries who possess the same. So let's take now a wide view with specifics. So here we can see especially the generational cyclings out. So they have the progressive era. And again, this is like a twilight or like a spectrum. Because, of course, generations live, several at a time, right? We're cycling in and out. We're coming and going, if you like. Right, so you have the progressive era prior to the U.S. Civil War. Part of that was abolition. Then you have the missionary era. So the progressive era with your abolitionists, we'll say, right? In that pre-Civil War time, that's your artist, if you look at the generational thing. And then the next time you see that sort, actually, they're a little bit more reserved. They're the silent generation, right? The artists are the silent generation here. And then the next one, you have your missionary generation. And then they correspond to the boomer generation prior. Well, yes, I shouldn't say prior to the Civil War and post-Civil War, right? So boomer generation, World War II, post-World War II. They're characterized by being the prophets. So you have, incidentally, during the missionary cycle, you have, or the prophetic cycle, you have a lot of religious movements. So think about this generation after the Civil War and think about the religious movements which arise. You have on the early end, you have the Second Great Awakening. On the late end, you have things like the Mormons. Actually, this beforehand. The Mormons, the Jehovah's Witness, the Christian Science, the Bible students. You have a lot of Catholic growth if you want to expand this stuff over into Europe. And I would be very interested to see have people attempted this in other language communities. But you certainly have a great Catholic revival in the 19th century at this very hour in France, for instance. So there we go. And now let's move to the baby boomers, right? You have your Eastern religions, your yoga, your theosophy, whatever. The original theosophy, this is the missionary generation of the 19th century. That's when that gets going. Okay, then the lost generation of the 1880s through about 1900, that parallels the Gen Xers. And you have the artist, the prophet. Now they're the nomads, they're the seekers, they're the sarcastic ones, they're the breakfast club, if you like. And that parallels the lost generation here. And then you have the GI generation. So by the way, right, this is your spring, this is your high, this is your next one. I forget the terminology. Right, your second turning is your summer, your awakening era. Then your lost generation is your unraveling, and then you move, respectively, from the GI generation to the millennial generation, which means if the forecast of a major war or series of wars in the 2030s, I did not say January 1st, 2030. Do not get hung up on the specific year. It could be 2036 or 37. Right? Winter could be hard, winter could be light, but winter will be. Winter might come a little early, might come a little later, but it will come. Likewise, in this model, the crises of the GI generation coming out of the Second World War and the Great Depression, right? That's their crises that whole time, and that produces the spring. So the millennials will be the ones fighting the war. This is when they're born, 1981 to 1994. They're going to be the war fighters. Maybe the Gen X, you could bleed into that. There's more ways than one. By the way, if you want, you can go backwards. So what would be the analog to the GI generation? Well, that would have been the generation, if you were to plot it out, that fought the Civil War, right? If you actually look at these 80 years, they overlap very nicely, and you can plot that out, the generation there, and you can say, well, what came 80 years before that? That would have been the 1740s, 1750s. Those were the guys that fought the revolution, right? It's the same thing. The beat goes on. The cycles repeat. Yet Americans will also enter the fourth turning, the crises, with a unique opportunity to achieve new greatness as a people. Despair that values that were new in the 1960s are today so entwined with social dysfunction and cultural decay that they can no longer lead anywhere positive. Through the current unraveling era, that is probably true. But in the crucible of the crises, that will change. As the old civic order gives way, Americans will have to craft a new one. This will require a values consensus. A rising of institutional trust, social trust will rise again. We are presently in a very low trust society. This is your background checks. This is your cameras, your Ring cameras. This is snooping on your neighbor, private detectives, and all of this jazz. That's going to go into recession. And what will rise after the crises of the 2030s will be a high trust society. And that will eventually decline, and the beat goes on. If all goes well, there could be a renaissance of civic trust and more. Today's third turning problems, this is the dissolution, that Rubik's Cube of crime, race, money, family, culture, and ethics will snap into a fourth turning solution. America's post-crisis answers will be as organically interconnected as today's pre-crisis questions seem hopelessly tangled. By the 2020s, America could become a society that is good by today's standards and also one that works. So the crisis will straighten out. When the World War II era has finally, and the World War II generation, and that whole thing has finally gone to its fathers. Maybe it's the 2030s. That's, to be, with hindsight, you could kind of get more specific there. Eventually, whatever the case may be, the winter comes early, winter comes late, winter comes. Eventually, these crises will straighten out to a more institutionally strong, although perhaps repressive conformity. Thus, and superficial success, we'll say. Thus might the next fourth turning end in apocalypse or glory. The nation could be ruined, its democracy destroyed, and millions of people scattered or killed. Or America could enter a new golden age, triumphantly applying shared values to improve the human condition. The rhythms of history do not reveal the outcome, of the coming crisis. All they suggest is the timing and dimensions of them. For instance, I alluded to religious revivals and things. That doesn't necessarily mean a Christian religion revival. I just said a spiritual revival. So there could be a huge flowering of Buddhism. Who knows? The point is you have a general certainty with qualifications that there will be, in this instance, a spiritual revival. We'll say after in the 2040s, let's say 2040s, 2050s, right? You don't necessarily know what direction that might take. It might be Christian, might be Muslim, might be whatever, right? You can't quite pin it down that specifically. What you can pin down is that there will be a great questing, because the prophetic generation will be living through the same cycles, unbeknownst to them, that what was the last prophetic generation? Those were the beatniks, those were the hippies in the 60s, right? That's 80 years ago by the 2030s, 2040s, when you have the next rising prophetic generation. And so it goes. Well, how did this prophecy do? In the year 2000, it looked like Bush-Gore might precipitate a crisis, but then 9/11 unified the country. Close to William Strauss and Neil Howe's schedule, the souring of many people on the Second Iraq War after weapons of mass destruction failed to be found in Iraq began to rend the country apart, fueled by a variety of different events. America's political and cultural polarization have grown and grown and grown since then. Okay, now they lay out a chart that really plugs things in. Here's another way of laying out the generational chart. And here's another way still, where you can see the winter seasons. So in this breaking down, going back to the 18th century, the Tea Act, that's your unraveling. And you can even say anything after the French and Indian War. And then that leads to the Revolutionary War, right? So that's your crisis, and then a new order is born. Fast forward 80 years, 80, and your Compromise of 1850 initiates the unraveling. And you can see in each of these that the period where the first arrow is in the second, that is to say the beginning of the unraveling to the beginning of the crisis being in red appropriately, you can see, right, this is much longer. So the unraveling, isn't as they lay it out here. I would actually, again, say that you can say the unraveling period is actually going back to the 1760s, immediately after the French and Indian War, up to 75. That gives you a 15-year period, right? Here you have, about a 10-year period. So, don't get caught up on the specifics. Like tree rings, you want to understand that there are variations here. These are general cycles. But anyway, the Compromise of 1850 here to the Civil War. Then you have your crisis. Then a new era is born. This post-Civil War new order that continues. Run it out 80 years to the Second World War, the Depression time. Okay, then your next one. Here we go. Right, Black Tuesday, start of the Great Depression, 1929. That inaugurates the next crisis, inaugurates the next unraveling. That leads into the crisis of World War II. That comes and goes, and there's a new era, arguably started, with the NATO in 1949. And then that continues until the next unraveling to your financial crisis of 2008. And then, again, a little bit speculative, but going off of these rhythms like tree rings, somewhere in the 2030s, let's say, you have another American war, another major war, and that will, according to this person, maybe be the tribulation, as the Protestants say, or Christ's return, whatever the case may be. We can speculate on what that might look like. Now, in the fourth turning, they also go back in time, so I'll find that chart. Maybe I didn't pull it up. Here we go. This is very blurry, I understand. So you'll just have to take my word from it. And if you really want to get into it, which I hope you do, you can check out this article because I just copy and pasted it here. So they have various of these charts here. You can check this out, but the one that I pulled up is here. It's pretty blurry still on this, but it'll be explained in text to help you out. I'll do my best right now. Indeed, going back to actually the 16th century. So you have the four turnings, and then the archetypes of the nomad, hero, artist, prophet, and then they just cycle through as you make your way across. And then the first cycle is Merry England, right? Queen Elizabeth. Then you have the Puritan Awakening. Then you get into your unraveling, so that's your reaction and restoration. And then you have your Glorious Revolution, is your crisis, the Puritan takeover, so-called Glorious Revolution, but I'll bite my tongue. Okay, and then you have the Augustan Age of Empire. This is the British Empire. Again, they're focused. Neil Howe and William Strauss are focused on the English-speaking world. I really, in my own research, want to find out if other people have tried to apply this to other cultures. Okay, but you have the Augustan Age, so-called, of British history that leads to your Great Awakening. That's your Methodists. That's your William Wilberforce. All this stuff. Actually, a little bit before Wilberforce, but nevertheless, your French and Indian War. Wilberforce would actually represent the more kind of more, how do you say, activist generation of the seeker. Anyway, Puritan Awakening. Okay, next one down. Okay, so the Great Awakening, religious revival. Okay, the next one is the unraveling, the French and Indian War, and that brings you to your American Revolution. And then at this point, Strauss-Howe splits, and then you follow your English history and then your American history. So now you focus the era of good feelings. Then your Transcendental Awakening here in America. You had a similar thing in Europe, I can tell you. That brings you to your unraveling, your crisis, and your run up to the Civil War, abolitionism, all this stuff. Then your Civil War is your crisis, your fourth turning. That leads in American history to the Reconstruction era and the Gilded Age. That brings on your third Great Awakening, World War II, World War I and Prohibition, the Roaring Twenties. That's your unraveling of the Civil War era, Golden Age, and then your Great Depression, World War II is your crises. That brings you to the American high, the 1950s, high social cohesion, maybe suffocating individuality. That provokes the consciousness revolution, your hippies and all this, the beatniks before them. That brings on your culture wars of the 1980s, 1990s, your moral majority, all of that jazz. And that brings you into the crises that we are now living in since the Great Recession. And the beat goes on. And that's what Neil Strauss and William Howe are getting into in this analysis. But William Strauss and Neil Howe's prediction of things coming back together seems unlikely. If Democrats got everything they want or Republicans got nothing, it's hard to know how things will be resolved. Part of William Strauss and Neil Howe's prediction is based on the rising generation being more civil than those who will be aging out of politics. That mechanism doesn't tell us with what settlement the current crisis will be resolved. But here is one possibility for a settlement of the current crisis. So you're taking notes. Beginning in 20 and 24, there is a period in which Democrats hold the presidency and both houses of Congress. But the Supreme Court and many lower courts are solidly Republican at that point. With the legislative and executive power in their hands, the Democrats would be able to get the most important things they wanted, whilst the Republicans would be protected by the Supreme Court from the outcomes they feared the most. Part of what makes William Strauss and Neil Howe's theory impressive is its predictions as well as its post-dictions. I flipped those. It's post-dictions as well as its predictions. So reading these cycles back into time and into the future. Here is a chart that we've gone through, and it lays out just what we went over. All right, so there we go. Some introductory words on the fourth turning. And this, of course, has been updated since, and there's a book you can download it courtesy of Yandex called The Fourth Turning Is Now. And they actually, well, William Strauss died. So Neil Howe wrote The Fourth Turning Is Now, and he brings the discussion up to his day and seeing a lot of those predictions and those patterns playing out. The beat goes on. All right. And so must I to the next obligation. And I hope this was insightful. And I look forward to our private discussion after this class. Again, in general, people who are interested in these topics, which are behind the news, they're behind the news commentators. They're not going to be necessarily on your podcast feed, but the people who believe they run this world certainly are aware of these discussions and these deeper meditations on events. And now you are. So anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for patronizing Apocatastasis. If you want to support us, we have Zelle and PayPal and other means to help out this college grow. And of course, the best way to support this institute is to enroll in our courses. Perhaps we'll see you in the Sons of Issachar when we run that soon enough. Thank you so much. Clarete.